to attain living wage in Africa at all. So with that being said, I will be passing over to our two moderators for the day, and that is Janko, who is an industrial and organizational psychologist, as well as the managing director of Human Interest, as well as Enitan, who is a lawyer by profession, a journalist, and a brand specialist. Together, they will be introducing today's speakers and they will facilitate our discussion. So over to you, Janko.
Great, Aura, thanks a lot. And to everyone on the call, the webinar, the meeting, whatever we want to call it these days, a very warm welcome from Johannesburg, South Africa. That is where I find myself. We have 3 panelists, esteemed thought leaders in their fields, and I cannot wait to get into the conversation. But we want to engage with you throughout the session. This is a conversation. There will be dedicated Q&A right at the end. So I want to make sure that we all understand how Zoom works. I believe that after 2020, we are very au fait, but I don't want to make any assumptions. So without further ado, in the Zoom chat bar, the chat functionality, I just want you to fire away where you find yourself as we are sitting here. Are you in Johannesburg, South Africa, Lagos, Nigeria, Monaco? Where are you finding yourself? Just fire away. Geneva, there we go. Johannesburg, Durban, Cape Town, Lagos, Krugersdorp, London, Harare, Zim, London again, Harare, Durban, Joburg. All the way from Israel, welcome Judith. Nigeria again. Brilliant. So literally from across the world, a lot of African delegates, a lot of international delegates. A very warm welcome to you as well. So please, as you come in, start firing away. We can see that you know where to find the chat functionality. And I really want to encourage you that as we go through today's conversation, you know, keep a piece of paper handy, make some notes, jot down your questions. You are most welcome that if someone, one of the panelists, if they say something and you've got a question, please fire away your questions. There will be a dedicated Q&A right at the end. We will, from our side, there's a big internal team that will monitor all the activity on the chat bar. We'll make sure that as best possible, we do get to that in that specific time period. So please do engage with us. Just a couple of rules of engagement as well. Obviously, you know, as we present, we will be putting our camera on and we will not be on mute. You are most welcome if you are attending the event to switch your video off. You can keep it on if you want to. Obviously, the presenters and the respective panelists at the time that they will be engaging, they will put it on, but we just ask that you do stay on mute. Otherwise, we'll just mute you from our side if we hear some dogs barking or birds chirping. I don't mind birds chirping so much, but we want to limit background noise. So really, really excited to be here with my fellow moderator, Enitan. Enitan, maybe you also just want to come in and, you know, just sort of greet everyone, and then we will start introducing the respective speakers. We have a short little video that we want to play before we move over to the first panelist. Enitan?
Yes, thank you very much for the awesome introduction that you've done already, Janko. I'm quite excited, and I must say that this is probably one of the few times when my co-moderator is so awesome, and I feel like all I have to do is just lean back and enjoy the entire program without doing much. But then Janko has taken us through everything that we need to do already. I'm excited, and I'm looking forward to this. Have an awesome time, everybody. Thank you, Janko. Over to you.
Brilliant. Anytime. I really look forward to sharing this virtual stage with you. So today we've got 3 panelists, and we're going to sort of take turns in introducing them. I first want to introduce Dr. Enes Meyer, who will also be the first speaker and panelist. Dr. Enes is an associate professor at the University of Cape Town. really passionate about the concept of living wage to individuals, organizations, and society. And without a doubt, through her presentation and her conversation, I think that'll become clear. But not only is she passionate about it, really deep thought leader in the field of living wage. She holds the research chair in the creation of decent work and sustainable livelihood in the National Research Foundation, the NRF's South African Research Chair Initiative. So I think we're all really honored, Dr. Ennis, to have you with us, and we look forward to just sharing and learning from you on the concept of living wage. Initan, our second speaker for the day.
Yes, our second speaker for the day is Dr. Timothy Olawale, and I will be sharing more details on him before I bring him on after the first speaker. Brilliant.
And similarly, the last speaker that we will have the honor of listening to is Bradwell Monderwa from Zimbabwe. He's also the co-leading the Humanistic Movement Network Zimbabwe chapter, and similar to Initan, when it is his time to sort of enter the conversation, we can see him there. Dr. Bradwell, thank you. We will do a formal introduction. Before we proceed and listen to Dr. Ennis, I'm just going to ask Aura to play a short little context setting video. Aura really positioned why we are here. You so succinctly at the beginning. There are a couple of key things and a consistent theme from the various speakers. So Aura, if you wouldn't mind just playing that short little context setting video for us, please.
Of course, I'm on it.
The living wage has the ability to benefit not only employees, but also businesses and society as a whole. Although it has been claimed that a living wage would distort labour markets and drive up organisational costs, restricting profits and long-term organisational success, there is growing evidence that this isn't the case. In fact, psychological sciences have shown 3 main ways the living wage would benefit the individual, the business, and society as a whole. The first is sustainability. A living wage is defined as the amount needed to live a decent standard of life, independent of welfare and other public subsidies. With the means to buy food, clothes, accommodation, and heating, evidence shows that receiving a living wage improves both the physical and mental health of workers. They are better able to recover and better able to build buffers to cope with unforeseen circumstances. It also lets workers focus their effort on one main employer, rather than splitting their energy across multiple jobs. The second main benefit of the living wage is choice. An individual paid the living wage can now choose to upskill. This allows for easier upwards mobility for the individual and can result in improved productivity for an organisation. Finally, the third benefit from the living wage is a reduced cost to the state. As individuals' health and skills improve, they create less demand for welfare support, allowing the state to divert money elsewhere. As well as these 3 main benefits, there are also further benefits for businesses. Employees on a living wage require less sick days and cover-related costs. They are also more likely to stick around, reducing recruitment costs. A living wage can also be an important draw for talent, and the increased retention means a more skilled staff. This can lead to productivity improvements and increased innovation, which can spiral to further boost employees' job satisfaction and further enhance their well-being. A more resilient and stable workforce can make a business more reliable to its customers and more agile when looking to the future. When looking at the psychological as well as financial impact, a living wage has the ability to lift an individual, their employer, and the wider society.
Great, thanks a lot, Aura, for playing that. So 3 things that we all heard there: sustainability, choice, reduce cost to the state. It almost sounds too good to be true. The whole concept of living wage. So is it, Dr. Ennis, I want to invite you into the conversation here. Your thoughts also based on that. Living wage in Africa, fantasy, fiction, or a reality?
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much. Before I answer your question, I also would like to thank Aura for inviting me to be part of this panel. And as you can see from my very fair skin, I don't look like someone typically from Africa. And so I feel very, very honored, especially because of that, to be invited to this panel. And Janko, thank you for the great invitation. I guess as someone with very fair skin living in South Africa, I constantly feel awkward if I make comments about Africa. So I just wanted to make that up front. And yeah, that I feel very honored to be able to speak here, but also that there's always a bit of awkwardness or uncomfortability that I have when I'm asked to speak about things concerning Africa, even though I've spent all my adult life there at least. At the moment, I am in Germany. I've got research and study leave. And for the first time ever, my laptop has told me that the internet connection is unstable. So I hope you're able to hear me. Janko, is it working okay for now?
That sounds great, Ennis. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, having said that, I'd like to come to your question. So you asked, living wage in Africa, is it fiction or reality? Well, I guess, unless I'm wrong, we would have to say it is currently fiction, because we don't have living wages implemented in countries, at a country level at least, as far as I know. But there are also many other countries in the world, not on the African continent, that don't have living wages. And some countries don't need it because they have a very strong welfare system, or they have minimum wages that are actually at living wage level. But in the majority of countries, and Aura had pointed it out, especially in African countries, we often have very, very low wages that don't allow people to live a decent life. And so currently it is a fiction. In future, I would like to argue that we don't really have a choice. So the question isn't really about, is it fiction? Is it reality? Is it possible to have it? I think the question needs to be, how are we going to make it happen? Because we don't have a choice. And that is what I would like to present as my contribution today. In order to do that, I will have to start very broad. And please bear with me. I will come back to living wages, I promise. But in order to understand why we need living wages, especially in the African context, I'd like to look at our survival as a human species. So, as I said, a very big question, and then get from there as to why we don't have a choice. We have to look at how to implement living wages. Why am I starting so broad? Because I think sometimes as people working in management, we tend to forget that there's a world outside the organization and a world bigger than the individual within the organization. But all these different levels, the individual, employee, the organization, and society influence each other and have an impact on each other. So a decision we might make at country level or at organizational level about wages that we pay people who work have an impact on the broader on the broader species of humans. And that's why I'd like to start at the very big level, the human species and the planet, and bring it down to living wages.
Dr. Enes, even though you find yourself currently in Germany, and you're saying you feel privileged, which I do as well. I'm an African. I've never been to any other country. I was born in Africa. I'm just of fair skin, and I think in South Africa we sit with similar challenges. And I know we're going to explore it now, but with a Gini coefficient of 0.65, that is sort of right up there. And what you're saying is, and I've got this apocalypse in my mind, when you say we need to start at the human species, because the concept that you're really talking about is the one of ultimate, sustainability, that living wage is about sustainability. And maybe you can just sort of explore that and unpack that a bit further. And you introduced minimum wage and living wage, is there a difference?
Yes, thank you. And I should have actually made that clear in the beginning, the difference between minimum wage and living wage. So minimum wage is often legislated, and many countries, including in Africa, have legislated minimum wages, either at a national level or negotiated by trade unions for particular sectors. And oftentimes these minimum wages, legislated minimum wages that have to be paid for people who work, allow people to survive, sometimes barely, but not really to live. And in the video, it was mentioned that what do we mean by living? It means that we have choice. Often people earn so little that at the end of the day, they even become poorer financially than they were before, because there's cost associated with working, like transport, that people wouldn't have if they didn't work. And so this extra cost sometimes at minimum wage level is higher than what people actually gain through the work. And so minimum wage levels are often very low, especially in the African context. And living wages are generally tend to be much higher than minimum wages, because the idea is that they allow people to live. And generally there's a contested definition of what it means, or contested definitions, but generally what they have in common is that it should include the possibility to save, so that people can put, if they want to, money aside for unexpected expenses, which often occur in the form of funerals, weddings, plumbing needing to be attended to. So a living wage needs to be high enough to allow people, if there's a wish, to put money aside. And so in that sense, living wages really are about sustainability. So this is a term that's often thrown around. What is sustainability? Sustainability is about that something will survive in the future. So if we pay minimum wages, it is about survival in the now. Right now that I have the work, I am hopefully able to survive, but it doesn't allow to save for the future, for example. And so minimum wages are not sustainable. But with minimum wages, with low wages, also come other things that are not sustainable. Sustainability isn't just about human life. If you look around you, where you're sitting now, look in front of you, look at your laptop, things that you have that are in your room, on you, that are made of plastic, for example, all these things are coming from the earth, literally. And so the problem that we face as humankind, far away from wages, is that we are not sustainable, because we're using the planet that we live off and on at a very, very high rate, which means we're depleting the resources that we have. So life on Earth is not sustainable if we continue in the way that we do, right? So if all of us on this call just simply continued life as we live it at the moment, we use too much. We use too much of material that is in the earth, more than what the earth can give and can sustain. So we're taking more than Earth has. And if you look at just the last 200 years, and you know the planet Earth is much older than that, but just over the last 200 years, and even more so over the last 30 years, we have been taking exponentially more from the earth than in the thousands and thousands and millions of years before that. So the reality is, I said living wages is a fiction at the moment. The reality is we are running out of things. We are not sustainable. And what fuels that, it was mentioned in the introductory video also to some extent, what fuels that? Why is it that we're using so much that the human species won't be able to sustain itself? Well, what has happened over the last 30 years? It is globalization, it is economic growth, it is consumerism, and we could possibly add to that also technology to some extent. While it is great that we are able to connect in this way, even though we are on completely different continents and at least countries in most instances, it is not a sustainable way of living. The technology that is needed for us to be able to do so makes it not sustainable. So if you look at sustainability in that way, not just the individual's human life, as a human species, we are currently not sustainable ecologically, economically, and socially. And that is why
that's not a pretty picture. It's a very, very bleak picture, you know, that you're painting there. And I'm sitting here and I'm like, are we doomed? You know, where do we go from here? And, you know, what can we do about this thing?
The great thing is that most of us have options and we have choice, right? So the one thing we could do is exactly to say, well, we're doomed anyway. So let's make the most of what we have and let's just continue the way life is now. And if you think back to the introductory video about the Humanistic Management Network, that's the part on the left of the video. That is the economist model, which is what we're currently doing. And what the majority of the world is striving towards is exactly that. It's to put the head in the sand and say, well, we're running out of resources. Let's just use it. I can use it probably for the rest of my life. So I'm going to use it. After me, people can decide what they're going to do then. But I'm going to have my fancy car and I'm going to change it every 3 years because it runs out of its motor plan, and then I'm going to get a new car, and I'm going to change laptops every 2 years because this one that I've got doesn't look very fancy anymore, and so forth. So that's one way of just continuing. But the obvious is that we could stop using as much of the planet as we currently do, right? Whether it's going to be enough, you need to make that assessment. Probably not, but at least it would mean that we're running out of things and later, and that we remain sustainable longer. Well, we're not really sustainable, but that we can survive as a species for longer. And what is really nice about that is that every one of us can do something, right? And in the video also a quote was mentioned, which I'd actually wanted to use here too, Albert Einstein's quote, that we cannot solve the problems that we're currently faced with the same thinking that we used when we created them. And so if you think back to what created us not being sustainable in the world, it's globalization, economic growth, and consumerism. So we cannot say that in Africa we need more economic growth and the prosperity of a country is measured in how much growth there is. And last year there's been so much contraction that, oh my goodness, we're going through recessions. It is really terrible. It's not going to help. We cannot continue with this growth mindset and the growth thinking in order to solve the problems that we're finding ourselves with, because these are the things that have created the problem. So what we would need to do is to rethink fundamentally how the economy works. We have to stop promoting economic growth as an indication of prosperity. Because think about it, for how long economic growth has been promoted, and look at how the majority of people on the African continent still live, right? It hasn't worked. So why would it work if we just continue doing the same thing? And we need to definitely limit consumerism. So this might sound to many of you as really airy-fairy utopia, living in dreamland. And I agree with you, it does sound very big and not very likely that we're going to change the entire system fundamentally. But what is really lovely, giving this talk now compared to giving it 2 years ago, is that I can use this as an example. Think about who of you would have thought that it's prior to 2020, who of you would have thought that it's possible to bring the world to a standstill? Probably the majority of us would have said, no, that's not possible. Yet it did happen in 2020 with the COVID pandemic. So things that seem completely impossible, radical change can happen, and radical change that affects life on Earth, life as a human species. So it is inevitable that we change the systems which we use to operate in, or we will run out of life on Earth sooner. Because we know it will happen, we're just not sure at the moment when it will happen. But we can still do our bit, yeah?
No, so I think you were leaning towards the doing our bit, or maybe not, So my question is, and I'm listening to what you're saying, Dr. Meyer, what's the greatest threat then? Well, what sits behind all of this? So what is the greatest threat to sustainability?
Yeah, so remember when I use sustainability, I'm thinking of the sustainability, the future of life on this one planet that we have. And unless Elon Musk is really successful in getting us all to Mars, it probably means life as we know it, right? So the threat to that sustainability of life on Earth is us, humans, people, right? And who is the greatest threat? It's those of us that take the most from Earth. And luckily, that is not the majority of people on the African continent, because they tread very lightly, because consumerism isn't as great for the majority of people, because they simply cannot afford to replace things on an ongoing basis and to accumulate material the whole time. Those that leave the biggest footstep are the middle and high income earners in African countries and across the world. So those of us who like to consume, who maybe have multiple homes, a holiday house and a house that we live in, or a rural house and an urban house, those of us who have large rooms, large houses, multiple rooms for us to live in, those of us, like me recently, who take flights, who have cars and drive around in their cars, who have gadgets and want more gadgets, have clothes than we actually need. So any one of us who have more than we need, we actually could do more to contribute to sustainability. And I'd mentioned it before, this is where Africa is really at an advantage and really lucky, because parts of Asia, South America and Africa currently is the most sustainable if we consider survival as a species. So housing is done with very little impact on the houses are built with very little impact on the earth. People using public transport is much more sustainable than using individual cars. So as Africa, or African countries, we are at the ideal place to direct a sustainable living agenda. I know we often take guidance from the US, from Europe, and we think that's what we should aspire to, but actually they are running in a direction that is not sustainable, whereas there's so much life in African countries that could actually show the rest of the world how we could live more sustainably. Right.
Yeah, I'm sitting here and I'm listening to what you're saying, Dr. Meyer, and there's a bit of an impasse in my brain. On the one side, you are arguing for the concept of living wage, which will increase a person's choice. And you've beautifully articulated that probably everyone on this call, we are spoiled for choice. When we've heard that Aura said, living wage in Africa, I think you said $6 a day, if I'm not mistaken. So on the one side, you're saying, pay living wage. On the other side, you're saying consumerism and buying power is negatively impacting it. So there's two sides of the coin. But one of the arguments that you did make is that it increases people's buying power. So there's economic growth and consumerism, the things that you actually criticize. So maybe just help me and everyone on the call make sense of what you're saying, because is it not opposing to each other?
Yes, thank you. That's a very good point, a very good point. And thank you also. It's important that I come back to living wages because I'm running out of time with all that I've said at the broad sustainability, survival of the human species. Right, so yes. Let me then bring the two together and try to explain why I still think living wages have to become a reality. So what I've pointed out now is that we really need a radical shift to the economic system. I've pointed out some of the problems. But also, if you look at the world and as it is now, there are very strong interests to maintain the system. And those interests currently are probably too large, too powerful for us to expect radical change. You've mentioned corruption as one issue, and that has to do with certain groups trying to maintain power. So if we now look at it realistically, my approach would be to say, okay, we need fundamental change, radical change. That's not going to happen now. So what can we do within the current system to slowly move towards something that is more sustainable? And to me, that is where living wages come in. There are other things also, but the focus of this conversation today is living wages, so I'll focus on that. What do we need ideally? We need to limit income levels at the top end. You know, those income levels where people have multiple houses, have a lot of excess that we actually don't need to live decent lives, and that make us live very, very unsustainable lives. So with that, we could stop consuming in the way that we do. It's probably not going to happen either because we would have to outlaw advertising. So there's a whole industry that has an interest that that doesn't happen because advertising is all about getting us to consume more. So it's not going to fly. But if we work towards that, we keep that in mind and pair that with increases of income at the lower end. And that is where I talk about living wages. Remember, living wages allow people to live a decent life, not just barely survive. And every time they are hit by a crisis, then there's no money and they have to get into debt because there's no chance to save, to build up savings to deal with these crises. And the consequences are ill health, for example, earlier death. So things that are not sustainable. So if we bring living wages up, or wages at the lower level up to living wage end, as you said, Janko, it gives us choice. People then get choice. Money itself is not important, but money is an enabler of choice, right? So while it is not the ideal, I've painted the ideal picture before, I think it can be realistic for now to say, let's at least bring up the lower wage end. Now, why is that? Because you might remember in the beginning I said, it's not just about economic and ecological sustainability, but also about social sustainability. And my experience really is only in the South African context. So for those from other African countries, I hope that this relates to your context also, but South Africa has a very, very high crime rate, particularly. So it is particularly relevant here, where we have a situation where we have no social sustainability. Crime is very high. It affects everyone, from people who don't work to low-income workers to very high-income workers. So quality of life is affected by crime, by social ills that we experience. And the research that we have been conducting on income and quality of life, life satisfaction, and depression has shown that money does not increase happiness and does not increase quality of life, really, if you look at the distribution. But what it does do, up to a certain level, is it takes the extreme negative side away, right? So this is really important. So it doesn't make people happier necessarily, but it takes away that stress that comes with not having enough to live. It takes away severe depression. It takes away severe dissatisfaction with life. It takes away severe anxiety. And because of that, it appears that money buys us happiness, but it takes this away. So if you take extreme stress away, you allow people to live healthier lives, and also this is my assumption, but you need to look into this further. It will take away some of the social ills that we're being faced with that come with continuous high levels of stress, right? So crime is probably as an effect of people living under constant stress, for one, and secondly, feeling that there's very little dignity. Again, money is just an enabler. Money doesn't give people dignity. But if you pay people so little that they can barely survive, what it suggests is that I don't value you very much. Your life doesn't really matter, right? Whereas if I pay enough for people to have a decent life, what I'm saying is your life matters. I value you. So it gives dignity. Right? And with greater dignity comes less crime. Yeah.
Perfect. Quick last question from my side. In terms of what you're saying now, we need to pay a bit more at the lower end, skim at the top, up at the bottom. Is that viable? I mean, I'm just looking at some stats in South Africa. Close to a third of people actually owe more than they own, and I know there's a difference between income and wealth. But I mean, in South Africa, 3,500 people, which is 0.01%. Own more than the most impoverished 32 million. So there is a significant gap here. So last question, 2-minute answer from you. Is it possible? Is it actually viable for employers to pay a living wage?
Yes, I think the argument I was building up to is that maybe that is the wrong question to ask. No, not maybe, it is the wrong question to ask, because if we start from the premise that we don't have a choice, it's not about do we pay living wages or not. We have to pay living wages. Then the question becomes, how do we make it happen? And there is an argument that it is not affordable, but it seems that in most cases, this argument is like an easy way out to close the chapter, to not talk about it, to not having to talk about it, not really having to think about it. Remember, we need to fundamentally change the way we think about the economy, about how we live, in order to be sustainable. So we have to stop thinking about this topic in the terms of economic growth, consumerism, and globalization. So there are examples, even in the African context, where it has been shown that living wages work. In a broader supply chain system, the 2020 Malawi 2020 or T2020, I don't know the exact name now, in the tea sector in Malawi has worked with supply chains to Europe in order to make sure that their workers can be paid a living wage. Now, Malawi is a very, very low income country in a much worse position than South Africa, yet it has been possible. There are smaller individual companies within South Africa that are paying living wages and that have been able to master the lockdown as a result of COVID-19 really well, because of the commitment that they've had from their staff, because there's trust, there's a willingness to give, because staff members have some kind of buffer, some savings, which they can now use when times are hard. And because they've been treated with dignity and treated well, they're willing to do that. And then we have broader organizations like Unilever, for example, who have committed to paying living wages across the world in all their offices and manufacturing plants by the year 2030. So here are some organizations which have taken the stance that it is not about is it possible or not, but it is about how do we make it possible.
Dr. Meyer, thanks a lot for that. That is all that we have time for. I think a real suitable start to a very important conversation, really challenging us in terms of our thinking, and that we need to change our mindsets. And also just by sharing 2 examples there of what is actually possible. So I really would like to also learn and hear from some of the other speakers now. I'm going to invite Enitan and Dr. Oluwale into the conversation to also get their thoughts on the concept of living wage. Enitan, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Ines. That was quite an interesting explanation or expose on the topic, I found a few things that I think really struck, and I'm sure that was quite interesting, was when you said that money doesn't necessarily buy happiness, but is an enabler. Now, the part about money being an enabler of choice was quite striking. It hit me right there, that truly that particular aspect of it. And then the link between living wages and the dignity of the human person was something that was quite interesting to observe. And of course, as Janko pointed out, the reality of it would we actually be able to say that living wages could be or could be paid in Africa? And that question still remains debatable as the conversation goes on. But then the few parts that I believe that Ines mentioned and that were quite striking and that really should be able to push the narrative and the conversation in the space, in the corporate space and in the space of employers is, do you actually have any form of dignity for your employees? Or does the government believe that living wages should be something that should be discussed or brought up? But then, so we're going to be bringing on Dr. Olawale, right, Janko? It's time to bring on Dr. Olawale. And Dr. Timothy Olawale, I would do a brief introduction as to who he is before we bring him on. Dr. Timothy Olawale is the Director General at Nigerian Employers Consultative Association, NECA. He has a doctoral degree in public administration from the London Bridge Business School and has over 3 decades of experience in industrial relations and strategic human management. Dr. Olawale, we're quite excited to have you join us today. And we do believe that you are adequately prepared to do some justice. So the topic of whether living wages is a reality or fiction in Nigeria or in Africa as a whole. And you probably would have some more things to add to what Ines has already said. Dr. Timothy Olawale, we're over to you. Are you there? Can you hear us?
Good evening.
Oh, great. Good evening. Fantastic. Welcome.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to be here, and I'm also glad to be online, notwithstanding the hiccups that I've also suffered with regards to digital expediency. But the important thing is that I'm connected. And I'm also excited at the topic we are discussing this evening, because the issue of comparison between minimum wage and living wage has been a very big debate, especially in Nigeria as well. Many times you hear the labor unions say, what we have is minimum wage, which is also not being paid by all employers, mind you, including government as employer. And you also discover that down the line, they advocate that what we really need for our workers are living wages. So the question is, what is minimum wage? What is a living wage? What differentiates the two? Whereas the minimum wage, as we all know, is recognized in time with regards to issue of employee compensation, is the lowest allowable rate of pay at which an employee may sell their work. In other words, it is legal, it is statutory minimum that all employers must pay. I hear Dr. Mayer say the living wage must be paid by us as employers. I totally agree, as a benevolent employer who also knows that it is important for us to show up the rights of our workers to get the best out of them. But I also want to say that minimum wage is what is legal. Living wage, why is the lowest wage at which subsistence needs can be met by an employee? It's about survival. It's about living comfortably. In other words, what is the minimum lowest wage that will make them live a meaningful life? That is living wage. So it's based on the amount that an individual needs to earn to cover the basic cost of living, the basic survival subsistence. And while this is not legal in most African countries, because what is legal is what is legislated. Now, the issue of living wage is a function of, number one, the ability in many instances of the workers to be able to advance their rights is a function of negotiation, which is also an outcome of collective bargaining. And it's also a function of an employer with conscience. I want to stress that. An employer with conscience. And you discover that most of the situations that we have in Africa, where employers, including government, are not too attractive to the issue of living wage, is simply because it is least in their priority. Because the conscience is not there. And I will also tell you, because I was involved in the negotiation of the minimum wage in Nigeria, I did ask a politician that if you have an Alsatian dog in your house, do you spend 30,000 naira that you are contesting is unaffordable on that Alsatian dog, knowing fully well that the cost of maintaining that dog is even more than what your manager earns in the office. So it speaks to the conscience of our leaders, especially political leaders. It also speaks to the conscience of our business leaders, especially in organizations that are not structured or organized, informal sectors, or those who run away from formalization of their businesses.
Okay, Dr. Olawale, I would like to ask you something at this point.
Yeah.
You have mentioned that there's a difference between living wages and minimum wages, or something that you now also mentioned. You did say that, as a benevolent employer, do you really think that benevolence and conscience should come in to the issue of wages for work done in this conversation around living wages and minimum wages? Should it be an issue of conscience or benevolence, or should it be something that should be statutorily demanded for, or at least be fought for actively? Because we're talking about the dignity of the human person here.
I believe it's something that should be fought for and legally demanded. But until it becomes law, there is little you can do other than to appeal to the conscience of all parties that are concerned. Some willingly will come on board and do what is right. But majority of African leaders, both in the private and public sector, will not move an inch unless it becomes mandatory, unless they have no option other than to do that. And the only way, the only instrument that will make them move in the right direction is legality. If there is no legislative instrument, at least I can speak authoritatively about Nigeria and some of our West African neighbors. If there is no legislative instrument, it's just a matter of you as labor union or representative of workers coming, discussing, and it now depends on the whims and caprices of the employer on what he wants to do or not do. But
okay.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, Dr. Lawale. I've had the privilege virtually of being able to kind of engage with you through your presentation prior to now. But then we do realize, and you did mention that there are actually international instruments on wages. And, so I would like to talk about those. And I would also like you to talk about the position of Nigeria and other African countries that have ratified these international treaties and our obligation to actually legalize those locally. Can we please have some discussions on that?
Well, like you said, some of the international agreements, standards, and convention on wages are far-reaching in their provisions. But mind you, I come to most of those international agreements and conventions in a short while. But mind you, the point I want to make is that when you have international agreements, except it is by judicial pronouncements, you have to domesticate those conventions even in a situation where you have ratified them before they become law, except they are part of the 8 fundamental conventions of the ILO, for instance. Otherwise, even if you are a party to a convention or an agreement internationally, you still bring it to your legislature that will now domesticate it and it becomes law and implementable. And some of these international agreements, for instance, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in Paris as far back as December 1948. I will specifically speak about Article 25 of it, that says everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sicknesses, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. And this is what I said about its being far-reaching in its ambit and its coverage, because it's not only talking of your standard of living while you are working, it's also talking about your health and well-being and that of your family, which is why we always say that living wage also includes social protection, for instance, like medical for you as a worker, for your spouse, and your children. So it also goes beyond that. It's also talking of your right to security in the event of loss of employment, which is absent in most of our African countries. You lose your job, you're on your own. Right. So it's also part of a component of living wage. You also discover that issue of sicknesses, disability. In Nigeria, we have the employee compensation scheme that is supposed to take care of this. But I also can say that not more than 40% of Nigerian employers are contributing on behalf of their workers into that scheme, which also exposes the workers. I agree that it is an essential component of life for a worker to earn living wage. We have instances where employers are even faulting and running away from responsibility even when it is legal. How much more when it is not legalized? You have the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that was adopted and open for signature, ratification, and ascension by the General Assembly resolution in December 16, 1966. In other words, it's been in force for decades. Article 7 of it says, the states parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to the enjoyment of just and favorable conditions of work, which ensure in particular, number 1, remuneration which provides all workers as a minimum with fair wages and equal remuneration for work of equal value and without distinction of any kind. In particular, women being guaranteed conditions of work not inferior to those enjoyed by men, with equal pay for equal work. A decent living for themselves and their families. We also have the International Labour Organization Convention 131, which is very important, which speaks about minimum wage fixing convention of 1970. We have Ethical Trading Initiative-based code. Code 5.1 of it speaks about wages and benefits paid for a standard working week. At a minimum, national legal standard or industry benchmark standards, whichever is higher. In any event, wages should always be enough to meet basic needs and to provide some discretionary income. And I also dare say that wages that are being paid in Africa today are far, far, far from what meets basic needs of the worker. Finally, let me speak about Standard 8.1 of Social Accountability International on Remuneration. It says the company shall respect the right of personnel to a living wage and ensure that wages paid for a normal work week shall always meet at least legal or industry minimum standards and shall be sufficient to meet the basic needs of personnel and to provide some discretionary income. In other words, it goes beyond even your basic needs. There's what is called discretionary income, what you cannot ordinarily predict, because apart from your basic needs, there are some necessities that will come your way. And the wages of a worker, a typical worker, cover that.
Okay.
Having said that, yes, I would have loved to
I have a question
answer that
for you.
question. Sorry, I would have loved to answer the question on whether it is a myth or reality.
Yes, please.
And the approach that I will give with regards to whether it's a myth or reality would be for me to look at the challenges to achieving minimum wage in Africa.
Okay.
When you look at the challenges, you know whether they are surmountable or not surmountable, whether it is realistic or it's just a myth. The first one for me,
yes, please,
that is very critical and important and is something that has actually generated massive debate, especially in Nigeria, has to do with priority of our political leaders and policy makers. Issue of staff welfare or the workforce welfare is very low on the priority list of our leaders. As far as they are concerned, there are several things that are very mundane and inconsequential from my perspective that are more important to them than staff welfare. And that is why I was at an event at the weekend, and I was told that the state government for many months now have been paid 40% of, because we are saying the wages are not enough. And government of that state have been paying just 40% of the insufficient wages. And they expect their civil servants to come to work, to be prompt, and to do their best.
So, Doctor,
on top of that, they are being owed salaries of 4 months in arrears. So what is being paid is 40%, then 4 months in arrears. And it's something that you can verify. Go to those states, you find what I'm saying to be true.
Yes, I can imagine that what you're saying would actually be true. And
yeah.
So we are seeing that it is actually not just a global problem, it's a very specific problem to Nigeria. But because we do not have that much time left, I want to ask you a question that you raised here. Why is the issue of living wage rising on the global agenda, and why is it important? Can you use that to kind of round off your session for us?
Yes. Why it is rising on global agenda, basically, let me speak to three reasons. The first one is the rising phenomenon of the working poor. That is, working people who are unable to make ends meet because wages are too low and they are on the increase. And poverty, they say, is also a fuel for all the vices that we find in our society. Yeah. So it's a big concern and a big issue, a time bomb that if we don't pay attention to, will explode on our faces. The second one is the gap between national minimum wages and cost of living, which is astronomically increasing. So even the national minimum wages that are being paid, or well, that is legal, are not being paid by most of the employers, including government. But even where they are being paid, the gap between it and the cost of living is ever increasing. They say the take-home pay of a typical worker cannot even take him up to the bus stop, not to even talk of taking him home. So it's a big concern because people are living in abject poverty. They can no longer make ends meet, except you are extremely disciplined and responsible. You'll be tempted to go into criminality to survive. And that is one of the reasons why child labor is increasing. And finally, the continued development of international standards for business and ethics has also brought it to the fore. Now people are more conscious. Workers are also conscious about their rights. They are also conscious about the fact that, look, there is alternative to you take whatever is offered to you. We can agitate for these things, and we have international backings, conventions, and public sympathy in our favor. So it's becoming, there is a conscious awareness, and many businesses who also care about their reputation, including government that is responsible and responsive, are also thinking along, seeing what could be done with regards to the issue of living wage.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Timothy Olawale. It's been an interesting conversation. But before you go, in 2 minutes, I like a part of your presentation that I think I would like you to talk to. And I would like you to talk about what is the dimensional approach that we can use to achieving living wage in Africa. Could you please talk to that in about 2 minutes, and then we would actually let you off for now. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay. Well, I propose 3-dimensional approach to achieving living wage in Africa. And I said, agreement on a living wage, estimates, and definition creates a scenario where our stakeholders can work together to improve the lives of workers with one goal in mind. And that is, unions are better able to negotiate if companies and labor agree on the living wage target. In other words, it's a synergy between the labor unions and the employers. They have to agree. They have to be on the same page. They have to also realize that it's an essential necessity. Secondly, governments are better able to consider decency in minimum wage setting, standard systems that are able to help businesses, owners move towards payment of a living wage. And finally, responsible companies are able to examine their own role in ensuring payment of living wage to workers, all without looking to multiple targets, so that when a living wage is achieved, it's satisfactory for the range of stakeholders involved in living wage issues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Timothy Olawale. As you have rightly said, at the end of the day, each player in the supply chain has a role to play. So I will be handing over to Janko, who would have some questions for you, and any other questions that we may have that have been written out, we would attend to them in the due course of this program. Thank you very much. Janko.
Great. Enatam, thanks a lot, Dr. Olawale. Thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. A couple of things that stood out, and there's some points of alignment with Dr. Maya in terms of really the mindset and the way that we think about things, that needs to change. You use the word, the conscious of the leaders, is actually so important. And if it can't start here, where do we start? And I was just wondering some of the comments in the chat from the, from the delegates, and we're going to get to that a bit later. There's a view and a thought from yourself that, look, it has to be legislated. And I think we're going to shortly talk about the concept of ethics that you touched on, so if it's legislated, is that just not another way for profit-driven companies to find loopholes to not, actually pay that living wage? And this is not something new to us. You read from, a document signed on the 10th of December, 1948. Okay, we are sitting in 2021 and we are still having the same type of conversation. And, you know, it could potentially be because it's a very relative concept. You know, we use words like, you know, decent. You know, decent to me is different to you know, to use someone that Dr. Ennis called to Elon Musk. Decent to me is different to my neighbor. You know, so that I think is something that we can potentially explore a bit later in the session. You know, what does that actually mean? I love what you said is that, but look, we started the conversation in 1948. We are continuing it in 2021, and people have, you know, people rights have really come to the fore, which really talks about that, you know, the conscious awareness of ethical behavior, and there's really sort of a bit of a spotlight on that. So I want us to explore that slightly later, because I want to introduce Bradwell at this point in time. You know, so Bradwell, as I said, you know, he's the co-lead of the Humanistic Management Network chapter in Zimbabwe, over 20 years of you know, professional working experience, but specifically on the concept of ethics. You know, he's the founder and the executive director of the Ethics Institute of Zimbabwe, and he's also an ethics trainer and a consultant. And ultimately, we want to change this behavior. We want to change and be sustainable, as Dr. Ennis has said. If we want to get things driven from the top or from the bottom, as some of the delegates have said, you know, we need to have a different type of mindset. And we need to think about things differently. And very often, you know, there's one thing that stands in that way, and that is corruption. It really is. So Bradwell, I want to invite you into the conversation here. You know, we hear that we need to take money from the top, you know, pay more at the bottom. We need to legislate this. In your view, you know, how has corruption contributed, you know, to the inability to maintain living wages in Africa? And, you know, tied to that, sort of a follow-on question, in your view, how can the concept of ethics help to mitigate that? Bradwell, we would love to listen to you. Just check your microphone there for us, Bradwell, if you don't mind. Just doing a quick unmute, and then we'll proceed. I think that's probably also the quote of 2021. Sorry, I was on mute. Otherwise, we'll just unmute you from our side as well. Can you say that? Yes, so it's either I was on mute or can you hear me, as being the quote of 2021.
My connection is quite unstable.
But we can now hear you, Bradwell, so you don't have to go with Kemi's quote of 2021.
You can now hear me.
There we go. Are we listening to you, Bradwell?
Yes. Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. My connection is quite unstable, but I should be able to you should be able to hear me as we continue with this conversation. Possibly what I need to do before I answer your question is to give an overview of corruption in Africa, possibly starting with an experience that I had when I went to Switzerland in 2015 to attend the Global Ethics Forum. I had an opportunity to speak to one Swiss gentleman during the conference, a conversation over lunch, where I asked him, seeing that Switzerland was a developed country, I asked him, what is it that has anchored your development in terms of natural resources? The guy looked at me intently, then he answered by saying, in Switzerland, we don't have natural resources, bountiful of natural resources, as is the case with you guys in Africa, where you have these mineral resources plentifully, but we are very good planners. That was his response. Indeed, Africa is known for having huge deposits of minerals, the gold, the platinum, you name it. But unfortunately, there's nothing to show for it in terms of its development. Now, you then realize Africa remains the least developed region in the world. And I attribute this to corruption, which is endemic in Africa, especially in the governance processes of its countries and in the business sector. What possibly would best explain the situation, the endemic corruption in Africa, is a verse is a scripture in the book of Proverbs, chapter 13, verse 23, which says that a poor person's farm may produce much food, but injustice sweeps it all away. Indeed, this scripture explains the situation that Africa finds itself in today. Without doubt, Africa is at the mercy of foreigners and Africans themselves. Government ministers, bureaucrats, and business leaders, they steal African resources and stash them outside of Africa in foreign banks, in foreign lands. So just as slavery and colonialism really took away of Africa's resources, corruption is doing the same with the same intensity. There's a complete transfer of African resources from Africa itself to foreign lands by foreigners in connivance with Africans themselves. I would give a few examples to explain my assertions. For example, the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index of 2020, looking at the first 40 countries, least corrupt 40 countries, the whole world, led by Denmark, of course, on #1. You find that Africa has only one country there, which is Botswana, and it stands at number 35. And the last 40 most corrupt countries, amongst those you find 21 African countries there. Meaning to say, Africa tends to align itself more with the corrupt than those that are not corrupt. And another example that I would like to use to support my assertions is that the United Nations, in a report, an estimate that they made in 1991, they estimated that about $200 billion of capital is being siphoned out of Africa into the other parts of the world by corrupt African leaders. And also the African Union, in a report that was published by the BBC in September 2002, it reported that 25% of its GDP, that is Africa's GDP, is lost through corruption, and that is equivalent to about $150 billion. So out of these figures, you can actually see that indeed Africa is losing quite a lot through corruption. Money that should have been going towards, towards economic growth, economic development, money that should have been going towards the uplifting of the living standards of the general people of Africa. So in an environment like that, certainly it is corruption that is playing a bigger role. That is according to my perception. Creating a situation where then African countries, most of African countries cannot pay. So really, what could be the solution to that?
I want to pose a question to you there, Brad.
Yes.
Bradwell. I think some really obviously concerning stats that you are sharing with us.
It's okay, Jacob.
Some concerning stats. In your opinion, how does this corruption relate, to the failure? Obviously there's a failure in the system with this money sort of leaking out, but how does that relate to offer living wages to employees? How do you make that connection? And you're sort of leaning towards what we can do about that. Let's hear what you say.
Okay. Yeah, we say in Africa, corruption is endemic, being perpetrated by its leaders, people in key positions of power and influence. It has become a societal problem, right? And we also have foreigners coming in, and we have business leaders also participating in this whole thing. And so we are saying corruption has resulted in Africa losing out in terms of its development. Africa needs to catch up in terms of development with the rest of the world. But with the kind of corruption that we have in Africa today, it's completely not possible. So what I'm saying is corruption undermines economic growth. Corruption really undermines economic development. And when there's no economic development, that means businesses are not able to give sustainable salaries at the end of the day to their workers, living wages, because they cannot afford them. So really, that's how the need. That's how corruption is actually negatively affecting the African nations to give living. I don't know that really answers you.
Bradwell, yes, yeah. I'm sorry, just a quick technical challenge there from your side. I think what can we do about this? Is Africa sort of unique? Why is it more pronounced in Africa?
I didn't get you.
So I was just asking Bradwell, so I think it's definitely evident that it's a global challenge, and that with money leaking out and we want to increase the living wage, it's not a good recipe. It's more so a recipe for disaster. Why do you believe it is more pronounced in Africa, corruption, than the rest of the world? And if you can also maybe just share your thoughts on what do you think can be done about that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's quite a fact that corruption is in Africa, and it's a global challenge. Yes, that's very true. That's quite very true. But what makes it more pronounced in Africa is its impact. Let me give an example of a situation of, say, possibly a well-wisher who avails money, a grant to support possibly the alleviation of poverty in a community, in a rural community in Africa. That grant finds its way into the hands of corruptors who expropriate it. That means that community loses out in terms of the alleviation of the impact of such an act a corrupt act by those corrupt officials to the community. So that's what makes Africa's corruption really, more pronounced, given the fact that it undermines development, it undermines the growth of African economies, it undermines alleviation of poverty, and it undermines even access to good health of the generality of the people of Africa, especially the common people. So really, corruption in Africa is retarding African development. Yes.
And then, yes, it does. And in closing,
the second part of the question, can you come again with the second part of your question?
Yeah, so great, Brad. Well, thanks. Yeah, and in closing, before I sort of hand back to Enitan, what is one or two things that can be done about that? Is it something that Africa needs to take ownership of? Is it something that the outside world can support with? What are your thoughts on one or two things that we can do to stop this corruption and mitigate this pronounced impact?
Yeah, there's quite a lot that Africa should do in order to stop corruption. I believe the best thing is to anchor the establishment of strong institutions in Africa, but anchor it on strong ethics. Because you look at the challenge, the corruption challenge that Africa has, you find that it's founded on the underlying causes, such as that have a strong cultural element to it, a strong social and cultural element to it. Issues to do with tribalism, improprieties like tribalism, nepotism, clansmanship, if there's any word like that, if I may use that word, the culture of impunity, where people in positions of power and influence take advantage of their positions to actually pursue personal interest at the expense of national interest. So I'm saying ethics can actually be used by nations and organizations in Africa to curtail corruption, to address these underlying causes. How can that be done? Certainly, if you have strong ethics embedded in an organization's operations, it gives that organization the capacity to address behavioral attributes, behavioral challenges, by way of developing responsible business conduct infrastructure as part of the operations of that particular, as part of systems of that particular of those organizations. That also being the case, let me also say that African countries themselves, they need to improve on their governance processes. The governance system, of course, there's much but I think it's not really much. In most cases, where you democracy, but every day, and I believe that Africa will be able to actually address issues of achieving sustainable living wages at the end of the day. Yes.
Brad, well, thanks a lot for that. I had a bit of a lag there on my side, so I sort of just want to play back what I've heard before we go into the general Q&A. Thanks again a lot for your contribution. I think what you closed out on there, what I heard really is about the governance mechanisms within organizations. And I think it's very much aligned to what was discussed and shared by some of the other panelists as well, is that sort of that bottom-up approach. You know, maybe it's not a either or, maybe it's a yes, and we need it from top down, bottom up, individual behavior that is all required. But fully hear what you're saying in terms of an ethical mindset, the conscience of leaders, and not only leaders, I think probably every single person is so important to really move it from fiction to reality. Enitan,
Yes,
back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Uncle. And Bradwell, thank you for the time and the time you spent with us during the session. Interesting ideas around corruption that you have spoken about, even though I had one or two thoughts in my head about the fact that in Africa today, it seems like we have kind of personified corruption. We literally talk about corruption like a human being moving around like one of us. But I'm beginning to see and understand that corruption is a mindset. It's actually something that we embed and we carry along. And so in line with this conversation around living wages, isn't it possible to begin to see how do we shift the same mindset that is running in leaders or in corporations or in people into being able to make things happen? But then anyway, Janko has probably summarized what you said, and so we're going straight into the general Q&A. We've had a few comments and questions that have popped up during the course of our discussion so far. And one of the questions that came up was this: should we be talking about a living wage instead of shared resources and shared prosperity in this age? You know, so when I'm bringing this question, some of the questions, most of them were so far addressed to Ernest and Dr. Timothy. But of course, now after Bradwell's session, there'll be more questions that come up, but then I would go through those as well. So I would want, I'm sure Ernest and Dr. Timothy are listening, but I'm sure the first question was to Ernest, and it says, should we be talking about a living wage instead of shared resources and shared prosperity in this age? Another question that was tied to that is, should living wage be equated to PDL? And Janko, do you want me to run through all the questions and then the answer, or do we have Ines or any of them answer immediately?
Yeah, I think what we could potentially do is sort of pose one to Ernest and then welcome comments from the other. I think I just see another interesting one from Ernest also coming through, but we can save that one for last.
Yes.
So maybe Dr. Meyer, in terms of Enitan's first question, if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts, maybe Enitan, you can just repeat that,
Okay,
and then we can then welcome thoughts from the panelists.
Okay, good. So the question is, again, should we be talking about a living wage at this time, or should we actually be talking about shared resources and shared prosperity at this time? And the next thing that was tied to that was, should living wages be equated to PDL? So Dr. Meyer, that's for you. And I'm sure the other panelists may also have contributions to that as well. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. And you're very welcome to call me Ines, also Janko, or actually you may use any way to address me as you'd like. It just reminded me I'm staying at my mother's house while I'm in Germany, and the other day someone called and kept referring to me as Dr. Meyer, and she said she had to remind herself who it was that he was talking about because she found it so weird that I was or her daughter was addressed as doctor. So please, you're very welcome.
I'm just giving you some more authority.
Yes, thank you. I feel quite important. Thank you. But maybe I shouldn't feel so important. Right. For the questions, yes. I do think that inequality really is one of at the core of the problem. So what I've been trying to do in the contribution that I gave is to first paint the picture, which Yaki, you're right, is a very bleak picture, but then to shift that to realistically, what can we do now? And so I do think that we need to address inequality. Is it going to happen? Is that something that is possible right now? I do not think so. Whereas I do think it is possible to start implementing living wages. And in the chat, I'd commented on some contributions by saying, not by implementing it through enforcement from government as a top-down approach, but by working with those organizations that are already willing and interested in implementing it. And there are companies who genuinely want to give dignity to the people they work with, who are interested in changing things around. And if we work with those that are already willing and supporting those, I think we can build momentum more as a bottom-up approach. Whereas I haven't come across companies, at least in South Africa yet, who would be willing to cut salaries substantially at the top level in order to get away from the inequality that we face. So my thinking around living wages is one of practicality. So what can we do right now in order to improve the situation that a lot of people in Africa are faced with? And I think living wages as a bottom-up approach is one of the possibilities. Something that two things that I had mentioned to just Mette, who has left, I think had to leave the meeting, and that is the role of consumers and how they can contribute or push organizations. And I just want to give you two quick examples, again, practical examples. In one case, this is the Living Wage UK Foundation is very strong and big, and in the UK, companies, organizations can sign up voluntarily, and I think that is important, that for now it should be a voluntary mechanism, voluntarily to be accredited as living wage employer. And I know a wine producer in South Africa, who, the UK is 80% of their market, so they export a lot, and one of the importers in the UK had said to them, look, we can only continue taking wine from you if you pay living wages, because we are living wage accredited. And part of the requirement is that we source our products from living wage employers. And so there is this pressure that can be put from other countries that are already a bit further in the living wage debate. That's number one. And number two, a few years ago, a documentary was screened in Denmark called Bitter Grapes, which highlighted the labor conditions in the wine industry in South Africa. And it had a big effect on wine exports from South Africa to, if I remember correctly, not just Denmark, but Scandinavia, because some shops refused to stock South African wines after seeing how poor the labor conditions were. And yeah, so the sales of South African wines really went down. So in industries where there is an international network, I think the consumer can play a big role, and other organizations. And then the second question I had seen in the chat, and then I have to show my complete ignorance here. What is PDL?
I presume that the person that wrote that should kindly please explain what they meant by PDL. But while that question is hanging and the person explains, we have a few more questions, but the next question is going to go to Dr. Timothy. Dr. Timothy, are you ready? And the question says, is the Dr. Timothy, I presume you're ready.
Yes, I'm here. I'm here.
Fantastic. Is the current wage gap in Africa not a huge barrier to implementing a living wage? And what steps, if it is, what steps can we take to overcome this? I can run the question one more time. Is the current wage gap in Africa not a huge barrier to implementing a living wage? And if it is, what steps can we take to overcome this?
The current wage what?
The current wage gap in Africa.
Oh.
So, we spoke about minimum wage and living wage.
Yes.
So is that gap, isn't that, and you mentioned, and has been mentioned in this discussions, that there's a barrier, there's a large gap, there's a huge gap between living wages and minimum wages. So is that a wage gap a barrier to implementing living wages? If it is, what steps do you think can be taken to overcome this?
It's basically not, It's not supposed to be the barrier. And rather than look at the gap as being a barrier, we must look at the gap as an outcome of critical issues that are supposed to be addressed that were not addressed. For instance, businesses are operating in very terrible and difficult environments in Africa. As a matter of fact, I also know that Africa is the most regulated business environment. And what is the concept of regulation to African government? Using those business interests as a source of income, making them over and over with things that are legal, illegal, and so on, taxes, rates, and so on and so forth, to the extent that they frustrate life out of them. And the operating environment becomes so hostile that you want to pack shop and just lock up. So, which is one of the reasons why many a times it is the workers that in part bears the brunt. Unfortunately so. So the gap is a function of some other anomalies in the system. So the question again that you have asked is that what is the way out? Number one, I want to say that it is very important for government to create an enabling environment for businesses to thrive. Number two, I also believe that the issue of living wage, Janko mentioned something with regards to the issue of, we have conventions as far back as 1948, and this 2021, we are still talking about living wage, yet we have not given life to those conventions. Yes, because in Africa, we are in an environment where there are no sanctions or consequences for impunity. Even what is legal, you know that many people will flout what is legal, what is law, and because of whom they are in the society, nothing will happen. There will be no consequences. And when there are no consequences, impunity will continue to reign. So nobody cares, because most of those that are the ends of affairs, or even business leaders, are even people that are also in government that are supposed to be policymakers. So they have a way of protecting their interests and covering their pitfalls. So until we become sincere with implementation of our laws, and with implementation of conventions, and with implementation of outcomes of even legal disputes, you discover that there are cases that have been determined in the courts. The judges will give their judgment and it's supposed to be implemented. But because some people feel they are more powerful than the system, nothing happens and no sanctions. And impunity will continue, and it's a bad example to others. So basically, I believe there is the need for us to turn the bend now and start doing what is right.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Timothy. So running on what you have just said there about, impunity, corruption, the willpower, I would like to throw the next question to Bradwell, and then I would like him to say, now, in light of the fact that we know that in Africa, Bradwell, can you hear me? Bradwell? Okay, Bradwell?
I'm getting
okay,
a nod. There we go. Yes.
Yes,
Okay, great.
Anita, I can hear you.
Yes. So now we have heard Dr. Timothy talk about the really what he has said in essence is the fact that corruption really plays the role, so to speak, in how the mindset that eventually plays out in how living wages are implemented or not implemented, because there's no sanction for violating any laws, and impunity just has the order of the day. So this question kind of goes, and I would like you to answer it in line with the premise that has been laid by Dr. Timothy. How and who determines concretely how much a living wage is? And does this level need to be, it says, how and who determines concretely how much a living wage is? And granular, does this level need to be given that material. Okay, I think I should rephrase the person's question myself in the way I think what it means. The person is trying to ask who determines living wages, and is there a particular level that you should think about when you're determining living wages, considering that circumstances of people vary? So you say basic living. How do we define basic living? How do we then talk about what the standard should be for living wages, and putting that in context of corruption, mindset, and lack of willpower? Bradwell, over to you. And you have 2 minutes to answer this question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Your connection seems to be slightly poor.
Determine it's to actually the government itself be to legislate. They are the legislators.
Okay.
To be legislated. Well, also the issue of you know, the economic situation in the particular country, from every sector of the economy, to determine where really the living wage should be paid, but of course supported by government legislation. From a corrupt point of view, like you are saying, I think coming up with a living wage, it's something that should go beyond merely coming up with a legislation, but seeing a situation of commitment by every sector, every member in every sector of the economy, going beyond personal interests to inform the way we should do things. You know, inspiring strong economic development, so that at the end of the day, a nation is able to actually offer sustainable wages at the end of the day. That's how I would possibly answer it, Anita.
Thank you. Thank you, Bradwell. I mean, very aptly and nicely answered. And because we have had such an interesting time, but then, you know, all good things sometimes have to come to an end to be continued at another time, I would like to ask each of the panelists to do a 2-minute summary of their thoughts or any last things. I can see Ines has put quite a number of thoughts around determination of living wage amount. And so you might like to say your 2 minutes close up in that area. We would also have Dr. Timothy prepare 2 minutes as well, and Bradwell 2 minutes. And I will be handing over to Janko at the end of your 2 minutes each presentation. Well, close up, not your presentation again. So Ines, 2 minutes, you've got 2 minutes, you have the floor to just kind of round off your thoughts and say your closing remarks to the audience.
Just thank you everyone for being such an engaged audience and for all the questions that came up in addition to what was said, but that also came up in the chat. And please, if you're interested in taking this conversation further, please do contact me. Because I'd like to be challenged, because only by being challenged do we learn, right? And this is a topic that's very, very close to my heart, and it's a part of the core of the kind of work that I do. And I need to do more, and I need to become better at it, not for me and for myself, but so that we can actually make living wages happen in a way that addresses sustainability issues and that makes people's lives more sustainable. So thank you everyone for all your thoughts. And Janko, no, I don't think we're all doomed, but I do think it is very helpful to focus on what can we do rather than to focus on what is not going to work, right? Because that delays us from taking action. So thank you.
So now Inetam fell victim of not finding the unmute button.
Yes.
So sorry. I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry. I thought I was going to be giving the floor before I speak.
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you.
I was
Thank
on
you.
mute. I didn't mute myself. I didn't unmute myself, so that's why you didn't hear me.
Okay.
The floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. Let me just emphasize one point, because we have to get this clear, that living wage as it is today is a voluntary commitment of employers to go beyond the minimum standard and pay enough for employees to cover their expenses. Unlike the minimum wage that is legal, that is mandatory, notwithstanding, you still have many employers flouting it, but it's legal and mandatory. Living wage is not mandatory. I know we don't like to hear that, but it's desirable and we need to work towards it. It's also a function of where you live, because the living wage in Johannesburg or Lagos cannot be the same as what obtains in Nairobi. It's a function of the economics around there. But the important thing is that it's desirable, and it is what we must all work towards. And I think the labor unions and representative of workers should shift now from demanding even for minimum wage to a living wage. That should be the point of their arguments. And they should always push for a living wage, because that is what is actually necessary for the sustenance of a worker and his family. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Timothy. So Bradwell, you have 2 minutes to share your closing thoughts to the audience. Bradwell? Janko, do you think Bradwell can hear me?
Yes.
I think he can, but he's muted. Oh, not anymore.
Okay, thank you.
Anita, so, I'd like to thank everybody for participating in this conversation, insightful conversation. I think living wages are attainable, are achievable in Africa, but what we need to do is to fight corruption. At every level, corruption needs to be eradicated in Africa at every level. And when we have eradicated corruption, we should be able to experience the economic development that we want to see. That should lead us into achieving living to embed strong ethics in their operations, because the challenge that we have in Africa today is more about a mindset, a misplaced mindset. So with strong ethics, we should be able to recalibrate our mindsets so that they focus more on the future, they focus more on nationhood, they focus more on sustainability, not personal gain, not the now as the case at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Bradwell. And so I like the way Bradwell went straight. Get rid of corruption, living wages should be a reality. Over to you, Janko. Thank you to our 3 panelists for such an insightful expansion on this topic. We really appreciate you. Janko?
Great, thanks a lot, Anita. I want to echo your sentiments, expressing my thanks to Bradwell, Dr. Timothy, and to Ines. Thank you very much for availing yourself and just sharing your experience on a topic that I'm hoping will not again have to engage on in the next 50 years, as it's about 60 odd years from 1948. I think at this point in time, I can only encourage us to look at ourselves. We are probably in a position where we can talk about it. We are not so much impacted by it. And a lot of the talk tonight was around mindset, conscious behavior, etc. So let us start being a shining light. Let us, lead from the front. So I think on behalf of myself and Enitan, and I'm going to hand over to Ernest shortly to formally close. To the audience, thank you very much for attending. I want to encourage you to, follow the Humanistic Movement Network on LinkedIn to stay up to date with all future events. As per Ernest's invite, engage with her, challenge her. I think challenge us all. We need to constantly challenge ourselves, to be better people. So Ernest, with that said, back to you, over to you.
Thank you very much to the speakers, first of all, to our moderators, and of course to all of you who have joined this event. It was a first, as Aura said initially, the first Pan-African event we had, and I'm just super happy right now how well it went and how engaged you were. If I look at the chat, it's just packed. So thank you to all of you for making this event happen and for making it a success. Now, the organizers asked me to do three things. Say a few words, and I'll keep it very brief, a few words on why the Humanistic Management Network exists. Secondly, on why we are organized through local chapters. And thirdly, why we do events like this. And now with that, the organizers have done something very risky and something very smart at the same time. The risky thing is to ask me these questions about the Humanistic Management Network and ask me to be short and brief at the same time, because I tend to talk about this stuff. Now, the smart thing was to put me at the end of the event, because now you can all leave without missing anything if I get boring and too long. But I promise I'll keep it short. Why does the Humanistic Management Network exist? Fundamentally, we are confronted with two macro challenges on this planet. One is the distributional challenge and the other is the environmental challenge. The environmental challenge, of course, is the climate change, but it is more. It is water quality, air quality, quality of soil, this whole bundle of environmental challenges we're confronted with. And secondly, the distributional challenge, I think it is evident that living wages fits in there. So those are the two main challenges we have, and we need to find answers to them. And those answers can't lie in running economic activities in the same way as we did over the last 50, 100 years or so. And with that, I would say the Humanistic Management Network exists in order to provide stimulus for how we can run economic activities in a more sustainable and in a more equitable way. And that is why we exist. We exist to progress, to support, to help us in learning on how we can run economic activities in a more sustainable and more equitable manner. Why are we organized in country chapters? We're organized in country chapters because contexts matter, and because Humanistic Management Network, at the Humanistic Management Network, we try to walk the talk. Context matters. If we've listened to what has been said today, the question of living wages is equally important all around the globe, I think, but it is a reality at different levels around the world. In the place where I'm living, for example, in Geneva, Switzerland, material hardship is a much smaller problem than in other parts of the world. And just to give one example, so the local chapters enable us to be relevant in what we do for the people that we do it for. And secondly, there's the walk the talk element, that humanistic management is a lot about respecting dignity. That's the foundation of how we define humanistic management. It is about self-determination. And so we can't really run a military-style top-down organization where some CEO dictates what can be done and what not, and then say we're true to our humanistic management principles. No, if we want to walk the talk, we have to be organized in a decentral way, and we have to allow a high level of autonomy for the people who voluntarily engage and give their time, their knowledge, all they have to offer to our organization. Why do we do events like this? And this is the last question that I was asked to provide a quick answer to. Simply put, bringing the rubber to the road. I mean, at some point we have to find ways and mechanisms how we can share the knowledge of the fantastic speakers we had today, and others, of course, in other events. how can we share this knowledge and insight with the wider community. And these events are a good way of doing that. And we have different types of events. We have the annual conference of the Humanistic Management as a global event. And we have individual chapters that are organizing and running events out of the context of where they are as a country chapter. So with that, I'm not quite sure who I hand over to close the event, or is that me, or
No, I think you're handing over to Aura.
Aura, are you there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Very good. So was that short enough?
Yes, that was short enough. You did it, Ernst. So with that said, I would like to thank everybody for attending today's event. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to our moderators. Thanks to Ernst, and of course, most importantly, thanks to our participants. And we certainly, as Janko mentioned, look forward to you guys following the Humanistic Management Network, or if you are interested in one of the African chapters, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, or South Africa, I'm forgetting my own, feel free to contact us directly on the Humanistic Management Network website. You can send us a direct message. And I will say no more, and have a fantastic evening until we hopefully meet again at our next event. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Bye,
Have a good
everyone.
evening.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Janko.
Bye, everyone.